Hi Founder fans, Jason here. Welcome to Federalist Tuesday, where we will be discussing Federalist number 24. Having trouble getting the words out of my mouth right off the bat, but that's okay. We're continuing our discussion, our review of the Federalist Papers, and unless you're new here, you might know that we go line by line through each Federalist paper, trying to dissect that 18th century language, which can be so difficult to get through from time to time. Now, I'm not going to waste too much of your time. We're going to get right on to it. So I'm going to pop over here to our read along, and here it is. Federalist number 24. Hi, Nick. Thank you for coming. And if you wanted to read along, there is a link in the description below to the Federalist Papers, this particular paper, that is. So, Federalist number 24. The powers necessary to the common defense further considered, for the Independent Journal on December 19th, 1787 by Alexander Hamilton. And before we go absolutely anywhere, I'm going to note this is one day after his previous paper, and it's further considered. So we want to note he is elaborating on the conversation he had the previous day that we had last week. And the overarching theme of that particular paper was that the first principle, the first reason we need a constitution, this particular constitution, is mutual defense, to protect the common defense, as it says here. And the means of going about that were threefold, according to Hamilton. One, raise an army and navy. Two, make rules for regulating the army and navy. And three, give the government the power to oversee that Army and Navy. So as we can see here, he's going to dive further into a topic he did not go much into last time, the powers necessary for the common defense. Now, he did briefly say, essentially, that the government needs any power whatsoever. I'm not going to quote directly from memory, but essentially said that the federal government needs a more or less unlimited power to be able to carry out the common defense. Hi, Alex, Troy, TJ. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome to Federalist Tuesday, as we might as well call it. Now, as always, these are addressed to the people of the state of New York. It was being written in New York to convince the people of New York to ratify the Constitution. This first sentence, you're going to notice something immediately. I'm going to point it out right here. The is capitalized. These are Hamilton's capitalizations. I checked several different sources for the Federalist paper thinking this had to be a misprint. Again, I have, of course, read the Federalist papers dozens of times in my life. It's been about a year since I've read them through like this, so they're a little bit fresh in my mind, but I did notice the first sentence had this capital, so I had to check everywhere. He does capitalize this, but starting off strange, let's get to it. To the powers proposed to be conferred upon the federal government in respect to the creation and direction of the national forces, I have met with but one specific objection, which, if I understand it right, is this: that the proper provision has not been made against the existence of standing armies in times of peace, an objection which I shall now endeavor to show rests on weak and unsubstantial foundations. So, to the powers proposed, he means to the Constitution, the powers given to the federal government. There is one particular thing that the Anti-Federalists are real angry about, but he doesn't seem to agree with at all, and that is there is no provision preventing standing armies in times of peace. Now, I know when we discuss the American founders in a modern context, it is often said that the American founders didn't like standing armies. And right off the bat, we've already gone through this on several occasions, but here it's very important to note, Alexander Hamilton is telling us he's about to argue for standing armies in times of peace. And one of the major points of the United States Constitution was to give us standing armies in times of peace. There are many people who hear me say that and click away immediately. These are not my words. This is Alexander Hamilton's argument. We're all going to have to live with that. With that out of the way, let's see what he has to say. It has indeed been brought forward in the most vague and general form, supported only by bold assertions, without the appearance of argument, without even the sanction of theoretic opinions, in contradiction to the practice of other free nations and to the general sense of America as expressed in most of the existing constitutions. So, he's saying that the Anti-Federalists who are arguing against the standing army are just saying it without anything to back their decision. They're just saying it because they don't seem to like them, but they don't have a real reason for it. And he points out here, other free nations have standing armies. All the other nations in the world have standing armies. And they seem to be claiming that it's expressed in the state constitutions, but he disagrees with this. The proprietary, okay, interesting way to use that word. The proprietary of this remark will appear the moment it is recollected that the objection under consideration turns upon a supposed necessity of restraining the legislative authority of the nation in the article of military establishments, a principle unheard of except in one or two of our state constitutions and rejected in all the rest. So here he's saying that this idea of not having a standing army, the army falls under the executive branch, but proponents of restricting a standing army want to restrict the legislative branch in order to control the army or the executive. And this doesn't seem to balance the powers, the checks and balances that the founders famously very much enjoyed. Except in one or two of our state constitutions, and I believe we are going to be getting into several state constitutions in this particular discussion. So, a stranger to our politics, who was to read our newspapers at the present juncture, without having previously inspected the plan reported by the convention, would be naturally led to one of two conclusions. Either that it contained a positive injunction, that standing armies should be kept up in time of peace, or that it vested it in the executive the whole power of levying troops without subjecting his discretion in any shape to the control of the legislature. So what he's saying here is if some random person showed up in New York at the time they're having these debates and read the newspapers, they think either, some people really want a standing army, or some people don't like the idea of the president being able to bring up a standing army whenever the president wants to. Now, Hamilton's going to say neither of those is the case, I presume. Okay, looks like this is a real long sentence. Holy moly, I must have missed a period. Let's get through it. We'll come back and go slowly through it. If he came afterwards to pursue the plan itself, he would be surprised to discover that neither one nor the other was the case, that the whole power of raising armies was lodged in the legislature, not in the executive, that this legislature was to be a popular body, consisting of the representatives of the people periodically elected, and that instead of the provision he had supposed in favor of standing armies, there was to be found, in respect to this object, an important qualification even of the legislative direction, in that clause which forbids the appropriation of money for the support of an army for any longer period than 2 years, a precaution which, upon a nearer review of it, will appear to be a great and real security against the keeping up of troops without evident necessity. Now, let's go back and get our way through this. So, if that same stranger that had come to the time period where Hamilton's writing actually read the Constitution, he would see that nothing in the papers was actually going on. The power of creating a standing army was given to the legislature, not the executive. While the executive controls the army, the legislature is the one responsible for creating it. He notes that the legislature is a popular body, aka elected representatives that are once in a while removed for new people, supposedly. And that the provision for standing armies the legislature is only allowed to appropriate or pay for a standing army for a period of 2 years. And he believes that this will be a real security against keeping the standing army too powerful for no reason. Essentially what he's saying is that the Congress can pay for an army for 2 years, but then there are elections that happen and people are replaced, and presumably there will be new representatives who enter the fray who will further have to be convinced to again pay for the standing army 2 years later. Now again, we don't talk about modern politics on this particular channel. If you were to argue that seems like standing armies have been hanging around for quite a while with no problem getting paid for, well, you'd probably be right about that. But we're not going to get into that now. That this is Hamilton's core argument. That because Congress, because the legislature, the elected representatives get to pay for the standing armies for a certain amount of time, that should restrain them from becoming too powerful and from the chief executive, aka the president, taking too much power with said standing armies. Disappointed in his first surmise, the person I have supposed would be apt to pursue his conjectures a little further. So this person who read the papers and got the total wrong impression and then read the Constitution and realized what was up, he would have to dig a little deeper to really make sure he understands what's going on. So Hamilton will do that for us, of course. He would naturally say to himself, it is impossible that all this vehement and pathetic declamation can be without some colorable pretext. So this visitor, this stranger, would say, wow, everyone's wrong. There's got to be a reason. Everyone in the papers is wrong about this. Hamilton is kind of falling into his Hamilton self. We're in a run right now. We're about 5 papers into a 15 straight Hamilton run of Federalist papers, and he is starting to fall into some of his old Hamilton ways. We've discussed in the past that before working with Madison and John Jay on the Federalist papers, or the Federalist as they called it then, he wrote 2 under the title Caesar, and they were very aggressive. And he changed tasks and tried to be a little bit more gentle with the Federalists because he was had such a heavy hand in his attacks. And here he's using the word vehement and pathetic. So he is kind of falling back into his old angry habits, as Hamilton was wont to do from time to time. But again, he's saying that this stranger needs to dig a little bit more. Why are people so confused in the papers? It must needs be that this people, so jealous of their liberties, have, in all the preceding models of the constitutions which they have established, inserted the most precise and rigid precautions on this point, the omission of which, in the new plan, has given birth to all this apprehension and clamor. So here Hamilton is saying that this stranger who's digging deeper, basically what he's saying here is, if the Anti-Federalists are so scared of the federal government not being stringent enough on how they control standing armies, surely their state constitutions, which they prefer as their main source of government, would themselves have provisions against standing armies, right? New York State should have provisions against standing armies. Virginia, Rhode Island should have provisions against standing armies, right? Well, not necessarily. I'm going to point out here, right here, there is a footnote. I'm going to read through this and then we'll bounce down to the footnote and come back. Some of the Federalist papers to this point have had short footnotes, and I've omitted those because it gets a little clunky going to the footnotes, and they are very small. This is the first footnote that's substantial and really contributes to the conversation, so I did include it here. So we are going to bounce down to that at the bottom. But first, we'll read through this. If, under this impression, he proceeded to pass in review the several state constitutions, how great would be his disappointment to find that two only of them contain an interdiction of standing armies in times of peace, that the other 11 had either observed a profound silence on the subject, or had in express terms admitted the right of the legislature to authorize their existence. So here he is saying what we were essentially saying before. If the people who are so against the omission of control of a standing army in the federal constitution, then their state constitution should have something about standing armies, right? Well, he says only 2 actually contain anything. So we're going to go down all the way down to that footnote here. Oh, it's a long way down. It's a little bit long. It's not as long as it seems. Don't worry. Although this is a serious footnote, and that's why I included it. This statement of the matter is taken from the printed collection of state constitutions. Pennsylvania and North Carolina are the 2 which contain the interdiction in these words. Quote, as standing armies in times of peace are dangerous to liberty, they ought not to be kept up. This is notable because Pennsylvania ratified the Constitution real quick by the time Hamilton's writing this paper. Or about the same time, actually. North Carolina would vote down the Constitution for a while. So, North Carolina, the Anti-Federalists down there, they're not being hypocrites according to what Hamilton's saying. The ones in New York, well, we'll see. So, he capitalized they ought not. It doesn't say they shouldn't. It says they ought not. So, this is, in truth, rather a caution than a prohibition. Again, his capital is not mine. New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Delaware, and Maryland have, in each of their Bills of Rights, a clause to this effect. Standing armies are dangerous to liberty and ought not to be raised or kept up without the consent of the legislature. So, what he's saying here, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Delaware, and Maryland are saying exactly what the Constitution, the federal Constitution says, that they ought not to be kept up without the consent of the legislature, which is a formal admission of the authority of the legislature. New York, again, he's writing in New York to the people of New York because New York is the state that needs convincing. New York has no Bills of Rights, and her Constitution says not a word about the matter. So, these Anti-Federalists who are arguing for a Bill of Rights in New York, they don't even have a Bill of Rights in New York, and they're arguing that why is there omissions about a standing army? Well, New York says nothing about a standing army. Doesn't say you can't. Doesn't say anything. No Bills of Rights appear annexed to the constitutions of other states except the foregoing, and their constitutions are equally silent. So, all the rest of the states that aren't mentioned also don't say anything about standing armies. I am told, however, that 1 or 2 states have Bills of Rights which do not appear in this collection, but that those also recognize the right of the legislative authority in that respect. So, he's saying that he has a collection, literally a collection of the state constitutions, and he's admitting that I understand my collection of the constitutions, some of the Bills of Rights are written separately than the constitutions and therefore are not included here. Like, he says nothing about the Virginia Bill of Rights, and famously George Mason had written the Virginia Bill of Rights. So that definitely existed. As we go back up here, I do see a question coming in. I'm gonna see what Troy is asking real quick. I just want to find where I was. There we was. Here we go. None of those states had a standing army, right? All were militia, state, and local. I wonder when he became Secretary of Treasury, he fought to get a standing army in Congress. Yeah, they built a standing army almost right away. And Hamilton actually also, after he, as Secretary of the Treasury, starts the revenue cutters, which was essentially the forerunner of the Coast Guard. He put a guy named Hopley Eaton in charge, or the Revenue Marine, it was called perhaps. Essentially small boats that went around making sure everyone was paying their taxes, no one was smuggling. So he does build a navy real quick. Troy, I believe most of them are state and local militias. Yes, and that is how they viewed them, and that's why the Anti-Federalists would not consider themselves hypocrites in this scenario because they don't have a standing army. They have a militia made up of the citizenry. Though I believe it's this paper, might be a future paper, but I believe it's this paper where he gets into New York and how there is the governor can call in the militia as a standing army essentially at any time. Additionally, I know Rhode Island did have an army. Of all the states, I know Rhode Island had an army during the Revolution itself. Rhode Island had a militia and a Rhode Island army and the Continental Army. I'm not sure exactly how it's operating at this point, though. But let's continue. Great questions. Thank you, guys. Excuse me. Still, however, he's going back to that imaginary gentleman who came to New York to read the arguments in the papers. Still, however, he would be persuaded that there must be some plausible foundation for the cry raised on this head. So, there must be some reason that everyone's so up in arms by this omission in the Constitution, despite Hamilton believing he just proved it was a worthless critique. He would never be able to imagine why any source of information remained unexplored, that it was nothing more than an experiment upon the public credulity dictated either by a deliberate intention to deceive or by the overflowing of a zeal too intemperate to be ingenuous. Tricky language here, of course, Hammy. So this person, an outside observer, would be very confused at why people weren't digging deep like Hamilton's digging right now into the perceived hypocrisy of Anti-Federalists whose individual states don't have anything saying they can't have a standing army, but are very upset about the standing army in the Constitution. It would probably occur to him that he would be likely to find the precautions he was in search of in the primitive compact between the states. Went too far. Probably occurred to him that he would likely to find the precautions he was in search of in the primitive compact between the states. The primitive compact between the states is the Articles of Confederation. He's calling it a primitive compact because he's Alexander Hamilton and he can't help to be rude publicly. He does eventually get shot for this kind of behavior. Let's just put that on the table. Now we've discussed is this what he's going to say? Here at length he would expect to meet with a solution of the enigma. He's going to go back and talk trash about the Articles of Confederation. Basically what he's saying here. No doubt he would observe to himself the existing Confederation must contain the most explicit provisions against the military establishments in times of peace, and a departure from this model in a favorite point has occasioned the discontent which appears to influence these political champions. So he's saying it can't be that these people are being hypocrites, right? That their state constitutions don't say anything. It must be that the Articles of Confederation says something about a standing army. And since the Constitution is now permitting a standing army where the Articles of Confederation did not, that must be where the problem arises. Spoiler alert, that's not how it goes. If he should now apply himself to a careful and critical survey of the Articles of Confederation, his astonishment would not only be increased, but would acquire a mixture of indignation at the unexpected discovery that these articles, instead of containing the prohibition he looked for, and though they had, with jealous circumspection, restricted the authority of the state legislatures in this particular, had not opposed a single restraint on that of the United States. To recap this lengthy sentence, the Articles of Confederation, they do prohibit the individual states from maintaining standing armies to a certain extent. But the Articles themselves can have an army of any size, according to Hamilton here. Before we go any further, I can't remember which Federalist it is. I believe it was the Federal Farmer. Don't quote me on that. But there is an Anti-Federalist paper that very specifically responds to Federalist number 24. And it goes into detail on how the Articles of Confederation does have limits to what they can do with the standing army. How it only permits standing armies for certain amounts of time, and only after the Revolutionary War ended, said that that army would need to be agreed to with an act of the Continental Congress, or United States in Congress assembled, which would need votes of approval from all 13 states. And in the midterm, until there was another war, there was very specific limits on how many people could be brought into the army. They had to be stationed at certain forts and could only stay at certain forts, and if they left, were no longer considered the army. They were very specifically for defense. And I want to bring that up right away before I forget that this is had not imposed a single restraint on that of the United States. There's an entire Anti-Federalist paper debunking this myth. Hamilton continues. If he happened to be a man of quick sensibility or ardent temper, he could now no longer refrain from regarding these clamors as the dishonest artifices of a sinister and unprincipled opposition to a plan which ought at least to receive a fair and candid examination from all sincere lovers of their country. So, any idiot can see that the Anti-Federalists are sinister and unprincipled. Again, falling back into that favorite language of Hamilton's, aggressive and mean. Okay. And he's going to ask himself some questions. How else, he would say, could the authors of them have been tempted to vent such loud censures upon that plan, about a point in which it seems to have conformed itself to the general sense of America as declared in its different forms of government, and in which it has even superadded a new and powerful guard unknown to any of them? Basically, how could these Anti-Federalists be so angry when their own state constitutions and the Articles of Confederation don't have any limits on what could or could not happen with a standing army? Okay, if, on the contrary, he happened to be a man of calm and dispassionate feelings, he would indulge a sigh for the frailty of human nature, and would lament that in a matter so interesting to the happiness of millions, the true merits of the question should be perplexed and entangled by expedients so unfriendly to an impartial and right determination. Again, if he wasn't an idiot like these Anti-Federalists, his words, not mine, they wouldn't be dodging the true merits of the question. That these are not. He's essentially calling the Anti-Federalists hypocrites. Again, the Anti-Federalists very specifically argue against this. At least once very specifically, but from time to time, they come back on this idea. They're not idiots. They are primarily concerned with a federal standing army, made up of men from all the states who have no attachment to their homes, as opposed to the state standing armies, which Troy points out essentially were militias made up of the people themselves, who it would take a lot for the people to turn on their own villages, their own citizens, their friends and family, should the governor order them out. Though, as Anti-Federalists do argue, Hamilton and the Federalists like to point out, this is a good way to suppress rebellions like happened in Massachusetts during Shays' Rebellion, to which the Anti-Federalists like to respond, but Massachusetts suppressed that rebellion. It wasn't that big a deal. Even such a man could hardly forbear remarking that a conduct of this kind has too much the appearance of an intention to mislead the people by alarming their passions, rather than convince them by arguments addressed to their understandings. The Anti-Federalists, he's saying, would rather scare you and fill you with fear and alarm your passions and make you want to act irrationally against the Constitution than actually discuss the merits of debate. Not that Hamilton out here calling people sinister or anything of that nature, or saying they have an intention to mislead. That's not inflaming the passions. No, no, no. Allie Hams would never do something like that. I'm going to take a quick sip of water here. As I like to say in these discussions, as compared to James Madison, Alexander Hamilton very much likes to inflame your passions. James Madison likes to write doctoral dissertations. But however little this objection may be countenanced, even by precedents among ourselves, it may be satisfactory to take a nearer view of its intrinsic measurements. So, even though these Anti-Federalists are being giant buttheads, we should still look deeper at the subject while we're here. Why not? From a close examination, it will appear that restraints upon the discretion of the legislature in respect to military establishments in times of peace would be improper to be imposed, and if imposed from the necessities of society, would be unlikely to be observed. So, restraints upon the discretion of the legislature in respect to the military. So, say we did do what the Anti-Federalists want, and only let the legislature do certain things. Again, anyone joining us late, he had earlier said that the main restraint on the military was that the legislature appropriated money or paid for it for a limit of 2 years. So let's say the Anti-Federalists are right and there isn't that restraint. It would be improper to impose it, of course, and if imposed, it would be unlikely to be observed. So if there was a standing army that the Congress could just make for whatever it wanted to do, it's just chances that people would join that army and that it would be obeyed are very small, apparently. Though a wide ocean separates the United States from Europe, yet there are various considerations that warn us against an excess of confidence or security. So, sure, Europe is the biggest threat in the world with their navies, and there's a whole ocean in between us and Europe. But just because we have that border of an ocean doesn't mean we should be confident that they're not going to just show up one day doing some warring. On one side of us, and stretching far into our rear, are growing settlements subject to the dominion of Britain, aka Canada. We have British Canada, and it keeps getting bigger. They're going west. On the other side, and extending to meet those British settlements, are colonies and establishments subject to the dominion of Spain. So, I mean, at this point, when he's discussing this, Florida, over to Louisiana, up the Mississippi, all the way to the Great Lakes, and into Canada, Spain. We are surrounded by Britain and Spain. This situation and the vicinity of West India Islands belonging to these two powers create between them, in respect to their American possessions and in relation to us, a common interest. He's saying, in relation to the United States, both Britain and Spain, they're kind of allies, the way they're looking at us. The savage tribes, his words not mine, on our western frontier ought to be regarded as our natural enemies. They're natural allies, because they have the most to fear from us and the most to hope from them. Essentially, the Native Americans are also someone that could make war on the United States, and he believes would be a lot quicker to jump to the side of Britain or Spain than the United States, which he's absolutely right on. This is what happened during the American Revolutionary War. They jumped on the side of Great Britain. And even before that, in the French and Indian War, they joined the French in Canada rather than the Americans with the British. The Americans were the ones seemingly pushing out to take over their land, when especially French-British Canada were quicker to become allies. They were simply going out to hunt furs and weren't really there for settlements. They did build forts, but they weren't expanding settlements like the Americans were. The improvements in the art of navigation have, as to the facility of communication, rendered distant nations, in a great measure, neighbors. Basically, communication has improved. Ships move so much faster. They have started making telegraphs in Massachusetts, not electrical ones, but they're starting to use steam power. Trains aren't far off. By the time the Constitutional Convention, they knew the Industrial Revolution was happening, and that's what he's saying here. Communications make this world quickly globalizing, even back then. Britain and Spain are among the principal maritime powers of Europe. Not much to translate there. Britain and Spain, great navies. A future concert of views between these nations ought not to be regarded as improbable. So the chances that Spain and Britain might work together as a team one day make a lot of sense. They both hate France. The increasing remoteness of consanguinity is every day diminishing the force of the family compact between France and Spain. France and Spain are growing apart. They did have traditional family ties between the two, but they were growing apart. This is literally 2 years before the French Revolution breaks out, so that's about to blow down. Not that Hamilton could have necessarily predicted all of that happening, but you could see some of it playing out at the time. And politicians have ever with greater reason considered the ties of blood as feeble and precarious links of political connection. He's saying here that intermarrying in European monarchs, European politicians have ever considered them precarious links of political connection. I don't agree with that at all. The reason that the Habsburgs married everyone in Europe over and over again and got that big old chin was because the ties of blood were extremely important. Troy, Anti-Federalist paper, giant butthole edition. Well, now I know what my first book's going to be. Thank you for the title, Troy. These circumstances combined admonish us not to be too sanguine in considering ourselves as entirely out of the reach of danger. So basically this whole paragraph was to say, Europe can attack us at any time, as could the Native Americans. Great, thanks. Thanks for making it lengthier than it had to be, Hams. Previous to the Revolution and ever since the peace, there's been a constant necessity for keeping small garrisons on our western frontier. So they are keeping garrisons on the frontier. We mentioned this a little bit earlier, that the Articles of Confederation did a lot, despite what Hamilton said before, for a certain amount of standing army, particularly on the western frontier. And this is going to be one of Hamilton's best arguments in all the Federalist papers that we're hitting on now. We have to, because of the Native Americans, I'll read it first. No person can doubt that these will continue to be indispensable, if it should only be against the ravages and depredations of the Indians. His words, not mine. At the very least, the Native Americans, they are on the American frontier, in the Northwest Territory, where they just signed, literally just signed the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, making that federal territory and setting it up for future statehood. At the Northwest Indian War has already broken out. So while he's writing this, the Continental Congress is already fighting another war with the Native Americans that have formed a confederacy in that part of the world to fight off the United States and the encroachments that the Americans were so excited to do after throwing off the King of England, who had issued that proclamation line of 1763, making sure the Americans couldn't get up there. So there were forts there. What we might call Pittsburgh today was Fort Pitt. By this point had been Fort Necessity earlier, and several other forts of that nature. These garrisons must either be furnished by occasional detachments from the militia or by permanent corps in the pay of government. So these frontier posts either need to be militiamen, regular people who train from time to time and are taken from the citizenry, who need to volunteer their time to go up and sit at a fort for a little while to make sure the Native Americans don't attack, or we can have a standing army that garrisons these forts. Paid soldiers, not militiamen, actual trained soldiers. Now, this is going to fall on the ears of people at the time very strongly because they remember the difference between before von Steuben came to Valley Forge and after von Steuben came to Valley Forge, when it was a ragtag militia that he, I don't want to say single-handedly, but played a huge role in training into a real, actual army of soldiers. And this was huge for the Revolutionary War because Britain was soldiers. Britain sent soldiers who would walk into the line of fire. They weren't going to turn around and run. The militia often did. So, between militiamen and soldiers, we're discussing now. The first is impracticable, and if practicable, would be pernicious. So, the idea of militiamen isn't practical. The militia would not long, if at all, submit to be dragged from their occupations and families to perform that most disagreeable duty in times of profound peace. So if there is no war, the militia doesn't feel the need to be called out. They might train in their local areas because, well-regulated militia in the Second Amendment was very important at the time. Every able-bodied man at the time, but we'll say person if we were doing it now, every able-bodied person does have the duty to go train their public virtue, make sure they can handle their weapon, make sure they can drill and move with their men. But just because they're ready for invasion doesn't mean they're ready to go from, Connecticut out to the coasts of, the frontier of Pennsylvania for a month in the middle of, they're working, they're going to leave their families behind. For why? Why are we sitting here? And if they could be prevailed upon or compelled to do it, the increased expense of a frequent rotation of service, at the loss of labor and disconcertion of the industrious pursuits of the individuals, would form conclusive objections to the scheme. It's basically what I said. They're going to lose time either at their job or on their farm or with their families. They're not going to want to do it, and it would actually hinder people from joining the militia and pursuing that public virtue that they were expected to maintain at the time. It would be as burdensome and injurious to the public as ruinous to the private citizen. So it would be bad for both the nation and the person. The latter resource of permanent corps in the pay of the government amounts to a standing army in time of peace. A small one, indeed, but not the less real for being small. So, even if we just pay a few soldiers to maintain our forts on the frontier, they still are paid soldiers in time of peace, and therefore they are a standing army. A small one indeed, but not less real for being small. Now, again, as we said earlier, there were Anti-Federalists who said that the Continental Congress already had paid soldiers at stations. The United States Army at this point was only about 100 people, but that's all you really needed to maintain these forts in times of peace, was the argument against what he's saying here. Not even an argument. It's just we're already doing that. Here is a simple view of the subject that shows us at once the impropriety of a constitutional interdiction of such establishments. I'm not great at all the 18th century words. I'm good at a lot of them. That's why you come here. But it still gets tricky. Here is a simple view of the subject that shows us at once the impropriety of a constitutional interdiction of such establishments and the necessity of leaving the matter to the discretion and prudence of the legislature. So what he's saying here is, I think I've demonstrated, Alexander Hamilton, have demonstrated now why it's important to have at least some kind of standing army that is overseen by the legislature and paid for by the legislature. A quick sip of water as we finish up here. Getting pretty close to the end. For an argument for a standing army. In proportion to our increase in strength, it is probable, nay, it may be said certain, that Britain and Spain would augment their military establishments in our neighborhood. So, If we strengthen our army, even if it's just a small army at the borders, both Britain, in Canada, and Spain, everywhere else, will, in proportion, also strengthen their forces to make sure that, we're not planning anything a little tricky. If we should not be willing to be exposed in a naked and defenseless condition to their insults and encroachments, we should find it expedient to increase our frontier garrisons in some ratio to the force by which our western settlements might be annoyed. So, if they increase the size of their armies on our frontiers and we don't, what's to stop them from just fooling around out there, just being jerks? We, the United States, need to increase our forces in proportion to what they're doing as a show, a demonstration. Hey, don't mess with us. We're not necessarily going to attack you, but we want to make sure you're not necessarily going to attack us. Yeah, pretty much. There are, and will be, particular posts, the possession of which will include the command of large districts of territory and facilitate future invasions of the remainder. So there are and will be particular posts. So there will be forts that essentially guard huge swaths of land. And if don't have enough people in the fort to guard these huge swaths of land, what's to stop Spain from moving on over and taking some of that land? It may be added that some of those posts will be keys to the trade with the Indian nations. So some of these forts are not just important for defending the United States, but they also will be important as trading posts. He's calling them posts for a reason. Can any man think it would be wise to leave such posts in a situation to be at any instant seized by one or the other of two neighboring and formidable powers? So, should we leave these posts barely guarded by weak militiamen who don't really want to even be there, so that Britain or France could just take them and then do the trading? I mean, some of these posts we just took from Britain in the Revolutionary War. To act this part would be to desert all the usual maxims of prudence and policy. So, as you can tell from my demeanor, not usually agreeing with Alexander Hamilton. He's made a very good point here, and would leaving these posts unprotected be wise? Come on. Hammy doesn't think so. Excuse me. Got some sniffles. If we mean to be a commercial people, or even to be secure on our Atlantic side, we must endeavor as soon as possible to have a navy. Big change of pace here. Hamilton feels he's proven that at least some standing army is needed, at the very least, to guard the frontier posts. And now he's moving on to the navy. We want to guard our Atlantic side. At this point, the 13 states are on the Atlantic Ocean, all of them. And if we want to guard the Atlantic Ocean, need a navy. Not an incredibly challenging thing to say. I will note there were certain navies. We had a question earlier about, did states have standing armies? Only Rhode Island that I know of, but many states did have navies. I know South Carolina had a pretty powerful navy. I believe Pennsylvania had one too at this point. A few states actually had navies. To this purpose, there must be dockyards and arsenals, and for the defense of these, fortifications and probably garrisons. So, if you want to have a navy, you gotta have a place for those ships to dock. You gotta have some ammunition to put on those ships so they can go blasting their cannons. For the defense of these, you probably need fortifications for the dockyards and arsenals, and probably garrisons, because you probably need men stationed there, because we got this standing army we're proving we need. When a nation has become so powerful by sea that it can protect its dockyards by its fleets, this supersedes the necessity of garrisons for that purpose. But where naval establishments are in their infancy, moderate garrisons will, in all likelihood, be found an indispensable security against descents for the destruction of the arsenals and dockyards, and sometimes of the fleet itself. So, if you have a really powerful Navy, you don't need soldiers at the dockyards to protect it. Your Navy can do the protecting at sea. That's what navies do. But in its infancy, a new Navy, which Hamilton's proposing is created, for at least a period of time, you'll probably need soldiers there because you won't have enough ships to stop Marines from Britain or France or Spain deboarding and attacking the docks directly. So, Publius, okay, just comes in, quick ending there, just throwing the Navy out real quick. I presume the next article will discuss the Navy more in depth. That being said, I saw some come in. Troy, I gotta admit, Hamilton has a firm understanding of nations' situational sense. Yeah. Yeah. Welcome back. It's me. I am going to fix my... I'm a little unfocused. Gonna focus up real quick. That should be better. And let's do a little quick recap of Federalist number 24. So, Federalist number 24... Hamilton comes in furthering his discussion from Federalist number 23, where he spoke about the need to empower the government with the ability to raise an army and a navy. Hamilton is very much concerned with anti-Federalist arguments against a standing army. He spends the majority of this paper arguing for a standing army, which again, I know many people who like to study American history like to think the founders didn't like standing armies. Many of them did not. Anti-Federalists did not. And Hamilton talks a lot of trash in number 24 about anti-Federalists and why they don't like standing armies. He essentially calls them hypocrites for saying there should be limits on a standing army in the Constitution when their state constitutions don't have any limits on standing armies. And he goes on to discuss the frontier borders. That's the main core of why we need a standing army. Is on the frontier, you have the Native Americans, you have the British, and you have the Spanish. And these forts are concurrently, as he's saying, be manned by militia units. And militia units, while they are trained locally for defense, now you're taking militia from their homes and sending them all the way over there to those forts. Additionally, he doesn't bring this up, but militia units didn't have to leave their own state. So if you were in a New Jersey militia and they wanted to send you to a frontier fort, you could say no, because New Jersey didn't have any frontier forts. So that was an interesting argument he left out. But his main story is, do we take these militiamen from their homes who are only a little bit trained to defend their property, or do we pay soldiers to protect us on our borders? It's actually one of the most convincing arguments Hamilton makes throughout the Federalist Papers, despite the fact that it's squeezed in there between talking trash about anti-Federalists and a real brief bit about the need for a navy that he'll get to in another paper. That being said, if you didn't think the founders wanted a standing army, this is the paper you got to read. I will also note that, as I said before, there was an anti-Federalist, it escapes me, I can't remember if it's Brutus or Federal Farmer, actually takes the time to write directly against Federalist number 24, saying that the Articles of Confederation does provide for a standing army to garrison the forts. Again, it was only about 100 people throughout the entirety of the army, but even Hamilton acknowledges in this very paper that you only need a small standing army to garrison these forts. We don't necessarily need a giant one. And the Anti-Federalists would argue, we do have a small standing army. They are garrisoning the forts. That is a brief summation of Federalist number 24. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, do me a favor and hit like. I see most of you already hit like. Thank you so much. Thursday evening, we will be playing trivia as per usual. Troy, thank you so much. See you on Thursday. It's been a lot of fun. I will also have some more content coming out throughout the week. So my name is Jason. I am your humble and obedient servant, and I will be back with you live on Thursday.